asked, "Are there any lives of women?" "No, my dear," said Mr. Sewell. "In the old times, women did not get their lives written, though I don't doubt many of them were much better worth writing than the men's." So thinking about that, I found that the stories of the lives of 19th century American women are very difficult to tell unless a woman was particularly famous and public. In general, of course, being famous stems from being public, which for most of the 19th century was not a woman's place. If a woman of that time devoted much of her energy to home and family, does that make her story less interesting and less important? I didn't think that that was necessarily so. So the story I'm about to tell you is about Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister-in-law, Isabella Porter Beecher. In addition to establishing and maintaining a frontier household, birthing 11 children, and using her communication skills to help bind together the large and influential Beecher family, Isabella, through her direct influence on Harriet, played an important role in ending slavery in the United States. Before my research, Isabella was largely unknown. Her passionate opposition to slavery began with the 1847 murder of an abolitionist friend in Illinois. After the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, Northern abolitionists such as Isabella and her prominent husband, Edward Beecher, faced the legal requirement to return escaped slaves to their masters, who were largely Southern. The abolitionists hated this requirement and the terrible toll it took on enslaved people and their families. Isabella continually expressed to Harriet her extreme frustration that she could do little about this, finally writing, "If I could use a pen as you can, Hattie, I would write something that would make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing this slavery is." According to her son Charles, Harriet read this passage aloud to her family, rose up from her chair, crushing Isabella's letter in her hand, and exclaimed, "I will write something if I shall live." And that something, of course, turned out to be Uncle Tom's Cabin, which it is claimed that Lincoln said made the Civil War inevitable. Isabella's journey to this seminal moment was a circuitous and difficult one. She was born into a very prominent Maine family, the Porters, in 1807. Her grandmother's brother, Rufus King, who you can see at the far top of this screen, was a signer of the US Constitution. Her father was a man named Enoch Jones. After she married Edward Beecher in 1829, Isabella generally used Porter as her middle name rather than Jones, probably because her father had died when she was only 3. In 1817, Isabella's aunt, Harriet Porter, you can see Harriet up there toward the top, married Edward's father, the influential Litchfield preacher, Lyman Beecher, and moved here as Lyman's second wife. Isabella herself was in Litchfield during the 1820-1821 academic year when she attended Miss Pierce's famous Litchfield Female Academy. While in Litchfield, she befriended her distant cousin Harriet, who was also a student at the school. In 1829, Isabella married Harriet's brother Edward, who, like some other local boys, had also attended the academy. This appeared to be a good marriage for both. Isabella's family was at the time much wealthier and somewhat more prominent than Edward's, but he was the handsome young pastor of Boston's prestigious Park Street Church. Isabella may have been looking forward to a happy, stable family life in Boston with an influential New England clergyman, but this was not to be. During 1829, a group of young Yale divinity graduates called the Yale Band spread out over what had been the Northwest Territory to bring education and the Protestant religion to those areas. One place they alighted was the primitive frontier town of Jacksonville in the new state of Illinois, where they founded the state's first college. On the advice of Yale's president Jeremiah Day, they sought out Edward Beecher to be the institution's first president. As Harriet's grandson Lyman Beecher Stowe pointed out, nobody but a Beecher would have given up a powerful Eastern church for a feeble Western college. However, here was a chance to save that great Western country for education and Protestantism, always an irresistible appeal for a Beecher. When in November of 1830, Edward decided to take the job of this new college as president of Illinois College, Isabella was already pregnant. Instead of accompanying Edward to Illinois, she stayed home with her family in Maine to birth the child. Edward Jr. was born on May 5th, 1831. Unfortunately, after 4 months or so, I believe he developed what we now know as West syndrome, a rare form of epilepsy found in children under 1 year old. As is typical, this condition had a profound effect on Edward Jr.'s mental development. In a letter to Harriet from Maine in February of 1832, Isabella wrote, "As to my poor boy, he's better than when you heard last. Though he will continue to suffer much, he has had no fits for about 4 weeks. However, he has spasms more or less every day and cries nearly all the time. Some of the spasms are violent, and he screams very hard when he is in them. But these are nothing compared to the fits. He had 216 fits. I should think 400 or 500 spasms. It has been no light affliction to witness my child's severe sufferings. It is now nearly 5 months since he was taken. He hasn't smiled for about 3 months." There's more than a hint of desperation in the rest of this letter. Losing a child would be light compared with that of having to go through with such a sickness. I've almost longed to see my child die and would give him up willingly to relieve him from suffering. If he lives, he may be stymied by this sickness. In that case, we might rather see him laid in an early grave. Isabella then poured out to Harriet her trust in God's will and, quote, that we need affliction to wean us from the world. Acceptance of God's will served to rationalize for Isabella the suffering both she and her child were experiencing. Have you got me on there, or just the chart? Okay, well, in any case, where was the Reverend Edward Beecher during all this? Isabella went on to tell Harriet about Edward's fundraising for the college. I received a letter from Edward yesterday. He had just arrived in New York. He met with pretty good success in Philadelphia, but things looked rather discouraging in New York. Then she lamented, "Edward and I have practiced living asunder for the last 16 months. Pretty thoroughly," she underlined. "But for my part, I do not find it becomes any more pleasant by practice. And I long once more to be settled down and have a place I can call home." Somehow, Isabella was able to move to Jacksonville with little Edward in 1832. It may not have been totally apparent at the time, but Edward was significantly mentally impaired. In any event, institutions to care for children like Edward were just getting started in the East, and the alternatives to keeping Edward with the family were grim. The Beechers chose the humane route. After her arrival in Jacksonville, Isabella was quickly impregnated with a second child, Henry, who died in infancy. The reunited Beechers were having a rough time. Edward's first trip to Jacksonville was both long and arduous. I think there's a map there, hopefully. Do you have a map up? If you could put a map up, it would be good. In any case, the first trip was long and arduous. It took nearly 4 weeks. After reaching New York City, they would come for either Hartford or Boston area. Edward endured 7 days by stage to Pittsburgh. So you can see that, I think, on your chart. 5 by steamboat to Cincinnati. 9 days to St. Louis. That was on the river. And 3 days to Jacksonville. So it should be noted that Jacksonville is only 90 miles north of St. Louis, but that it took 3 days to get that 90 miles. At the time, Jacksonville was a rude, ugly town of about 400 souls, most of whom were spread out below the college established by Easterners on what passed for a hill on the west side of town. Travel in Illinois itself was extremely difficult during the 1830s. Jonathan Turner, a member of the Yale Band, described it this way: our whole state from Jacksonville to Chicago, you can see Jacksonville there toward the left, and Chicago, of course, as you know where that is. Our whole state from Jacksonville to Chicago was without a road, a bridge, or a ferry, and part of the way was without a footpath. Moreover, the places of rest and entertainment were log cabins, sometimes 30 or 40 miles apart. The state itself seemed like a boundless rolling sea. And that was in summer. According to Turner, during the infamous Winter of the Deep Snow, which was 1830-31, Edward, president of the college, had gone to Vandalia, that's another town, seeking its charter from the legislature and was expected back during the Christmas holidays. Unfortunately, he was snowbound in a local town where he met a Charles Holmes who had a powerful horse. They improvised a sleigh and during a mid-January lull in the storm, plowed through the 40-mile prairie to Jacksonville. Turner then remarked that was the only such journey that winter. Even after the Beechers became established in Jacksonville, travel remained difficult. Writing to members of the extended Beecher family in November 1835, Isabella recounted a trip to Jacksonville via the Illinois River. My dear friends, we are plodding our way up the Illinois in a steamboat, whose speed is not much accelerated by the boats hitched to both sides to stabilize it. She said, I was trying to be patient when so close to home, particularly when struck on a sandbar, as we were for 2 hours this afternoon. By the early 1800s, a new ideal of domesticity emerged in the United States, which began to glorify the private world of the home as a place where true happiness could be found. This elevated the place of women as wives and mothers. There was a growing literature on child raising, emphasizing that the mother, both in educating the child and in fixing his or her moral character, did so with a view towards shaping the future citizens of the Republic. Isabella's sister-in-law, Catherine Beecher, also trained at the Litchfield Female Academy, published, taught, and later lectured on this topic, eventually enlisting Harriet for a time. Isabella carried this conception of Republican motherhood with her to her new home in Illinois. When Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, he was struck by how distinctly separate the domestic sphere of women was kept from the public sphere of men. Each maintained a separate pathway, which he said kept pace with the other. However, despite the sense of a distinct and valuable identity that this gave to women, it merely postponed the question of overall equality. After Isabel arrived in Jacksonville in 1832, she settled down to running something new to her, a frontier household. In an 1838 letter to other Beechers, she apologized for not writing sooner, explaining, we have to salt down pork, try out lard, that means melt the fat, cure bacon, make sausages, and various other literary pursuits connected with hog killing, which some of my readers will no doubt think vulgar occupations. but which nonetheless come within the housekeeper's duty in Illinois. One gets a sense of the separate and superficially equal reality that Isabel was living in parts of a long circular letter from Isabella and her cousin, Mary B. Coffin. Let's see, Mary should be, there she is, toward the top, 3 lines down on your chart, if you, I don't know if you can still see it, but in any case, it was her cousin. So let's see, she said, this letter came from both of them, right, okay. One gets, this was just one of numerous letters circulated among members of the extended Beecher family. Often these letters arrived with a basket of fruit or flowers, and folks would add their ideas to the letter, and then it would be sent to the next group. Isabella recounted aspects of family life in Jacksonville. Of Edward Jr., now grown out of his seizures but mentally deficient, she wrote, "He hops, laughs, and pulls to pieces everything he can get his hands on, as usual." She then recounted various ailments that had been tormenting her other 2 children, Fred and George. Fred was upset, she said, that Aunt Catherine, that's Catherine Beecher, had left and very much wanted to see her again. This portrayal of everyday life would in no way have seemed trivial or unimportant to Catherine, who was becoming a widely published proponent of the role that these educated women like Isabella were playing in raising and educating their young while building their moral character. In 1833, Isabella had ventured out of the home to become a founding director of the Ladies Association for Educating Females, started in Jacksonville, which along with its successors provided funds for the education of poor women for 167 years. However, when it came time to give annual reports of the association in public, Isabella and her female colleagues deferred to the men. Despite all the demands of child-rearing, by 1840, Isabella was also teaching a small school of little boys who seemed to be drawn chiefly from a neighboring family. She wrote the other Beechers that she, quote, enjoyed this teaching and had been so interested in the school that she did not want to give her students up. Another part of the 1837 circular letter that I mentioned was written by Isabella's cousin, Mary B. Coffin, who was 10 years younger than Isabella and whose view of the world was more outward looking. Mary's mother, another Mary from Maine, was the sister of Harriet Porter. You can follow all that toward the top of your chart if you can see it. And Harriet Porter was Lyman Beecher's second wife. Turning a critical eye on Edward, Mary Coffin noted that he was reading a review of Harriet Martineau's book, Society in America. Miss Martineau was an English sociologist whose book, like de Tocqueville, stemmed from recent travels in America. Mary Coffin noted, Mr. Beecher is wiping his eyes and saying, what a fool. Who is he naming? Why, Miss Martineau, to be sure. Mary, who had already read Martineau's book, continued, how ungallant these gentlemen are. This fine lady, having a beautiful name and being moreover a beautiful writer, is tarred and feathered without mercy by her fellow writers. I think she will regret having been in this country until her dying day. Now, Edward was a devout Christian and probably took a dim view of Martineau's secularism. Likewise, his view of women's place had been strongly influenced by the opinions of his sister Catherine, who trumpeted the values of the domestic sphere. Martineau, by contrast, was a feminist, and her view of women's role in public affairs was much different than Edward's. As to abolition, Edward had been somewhat conservative on the issue, but this was about to change a month or so after this 1837 letter. One thing Mary Coffin observed in this letter was that Edward and many others of the good men will be leaving Jacksonville for the religious and anti-slavery convention in Alton, Illinois. And that I wish the rest of us could be with them, that's the women, for I think the discussion will be interesting. But traveling is out of the question in this state, for we have no cousins or sisters to visit, and the taverns are too well peopled already. At the convention Edward attended in Alton, he repeated his warnings to his good friend Elijah Lovejoy, who was publishing an abolitionist newspaper, the warning that pro-slavery forces were dangerous. The day after Edward left Alton to return to Jacksonville, Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob while defending his printing presses. Alton is essentially to the west and a bit south of Jacksonville on the Illinois River, Mississippi River area. Nearly 3 months after Lovejoy's murder, Isabella urged Catherine to action on abolition in a January 28, 1838 letter. She said to Catherine, "You're quite behind the spirit of the age. You must become an abolitionist or remain in the background. The Alton murder has brought us all over to the faith." However, Isabella was being careful not to appear to leave the domestic sphere. "I'm not coming out in print like the Grimke sisters or another Beecher." That was probably Henry Ward. I don't know. I'm not coming out like them. Neither do I, with my personal views, think it's best for females to form abolition society. She continued by quoting Edward as saying that the only thing that would save the country is abolitionism, and the only pity was that the movement had not begun 20 years sooner. She closed by relating that Edward did not think it was safe to travel to either Alton or St. Louis at that time. The Grimke sisters, by the way, were Southerners who had come out strongly and publicly for abolition. While content to remain a gadfly in abolition, Isabella had begun to tire of her nearly solitary role in the Beecher domestic sphere. Writing to the Beecher family in October of 1838, she noted, "As for Edward, you might as well look for the man in the moon as a friendship letter. He has hardly had time to answer his business letters. He is too much occupied with the general good that the private good finds little place with him. Thus," quote, "he has not time to attend to family affairs or his children, though he's very fond of them when home. He has been gone all summer upon business for the college and has now gone up north to attend a meeting of the anti-slavery convention." Isabella's fifth child was born a month later on November 2nd. Evidently, he was stillborn or died shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, Isabella was still dealing with George, Frederick, and the mentally challenged Edward Jr., although members of the extended family did help from time to time. In 1840, she bore another child, and this would be in your chat. You can see all these children in your chat room. She bore another child, Isabella King Beecher, who was destined to live only 20 years till 1860. By 1842, it had become clear that Edward was wearying of his duties at Illinois College. Isabella went back east to set up housekeeping in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On July 4th of that year, she wrote to friends and family, "Here I am alone this 4th of July noon with my two babes." That would be Ellen Marie and Isabella. Ellen Marie had just been born earlier that year. And unfortunately, Ellen Marie was another child that died in infancy. She said, "One is now asleep in the cradle, the other strolling about on her two legs, excepting when she comes to me now and then to be taken up." Isabella went on to report that the boys had gone to Boston to a temperance meeting. In the rest of the letter, she pointed out that Edward had been helping out a bit more with the children when he was around. Back in Illinois for the college's fall 1842 term, Isabella took on a decidedly political tone in a letter to Harriet, presaging her later prodding of Harriet with regard to abolition. First, she recounted the excitement in Boston about the Latimer case, which involved a fugitive slave whose owner arrived in Boston only 4 days after the slave and tried to get him back. The fugitive's cause was taken up by noted local abolitionists, and after an adverse court ruling, they succeeded in purchasing the slave's freedom. She noted that Harriet had probably seen accounts of the case in her anti-slavery papers. Next, Isabella tried to draw Harriet's attention to a fugitive slave from Kentucky who had been lecturing around Boston, a smart fellow, remarking that, quote, the audiences were exceedingly interested. Isabella noted that he spoke for about an hour and took a great number of questions from the audience. The name of this slave, she said, is Lewis Clark, and if he should go down your way, you would be well to hear him. He has much natural intelligence and shrewdness, but has no education. He tells the audience, if they expect to learn a discourse, they will be mistaken, for slavery and education never go together. By February of 1843, things were coming to a head in Jacksonville. In a letter to Catherine, Isabella asked what Lyman Beecher thought of Edward's plans to leave the college. Then she admitted, it would be trying for me to leave the West. No place in the world seems so much like home to me as College Hill. And our friends are very dear ones. And Aunt Coffin, that would be Mary's mother, I should feel we deserted her in her loneliness. However, I would give them all up and forsake the West rather than have Edward continue to raise money and carry on operations. It's the last thing he ever ought to do. Then she employed her wit a little. You might as well set him to fiddling at a dancing party or leading the dance at a ballroom. While he can preach about the college and excite a deep interest, if he had to go ask for their contributions, their money was pretty safe in their pockets. It is indefensible that the president should perform such drudgery. Of course, that tradition has continued in colleges. Edward did leave Illinois College in 1844. In addition to his trials trying to keep the college afloat financially, continuing tension between the Eastern abolitionists on College Hill and the pro-slavery elements in the town also played a significant role. Returning to Boston, Edward took over as pastor of the Salem Street Church. After the fugitive slave law was enacted in 1850, Isabella went to work on Harriet in earnest. According to Harriet's son Charles, letter after letter was received by Harriet from Mrs. Beecher and some from other friends, describing the heartrending scenes which were the inevitable results of the enforcement of this terrible law. Moreover, said Charles, cities were more available for the capturing of escaped slaves than the country. And Boston, which claimed to have the cradle of liberty, opened her doors to the slave hunters. As slave families were being broken up, he said, the sorrow and anguish caused thereby no pen could describe. Isabella wrote to Charles, I've been nourishing the anti-slavery spirit since Lovejoy was murdered when our home was in Illinois. These terrible things which were going on in Boston were calculated to rouse up the spirit. But what could she do? I thought, not much. So I wrote several letters to your mother telling her of various heartrending events caused by the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Finally, Isabella wrote the letter to Harriet described at the outset, which resulted in Harriet's promise to write what became Uncle Tom's Cabin. She later recalled to Charles, that's Isabella, that when we lived in Boston, your mother, Harriet, often visited us. Several of the numbers of this book, that means it was first presented in serial form. Several of the numbers of this book were written in your Uncle Edward's study and read to us from the manuscripts. When it was published, Harriet's book became an instant sensation and may have led to the remark by Lincoln to Harriet about its incitement of the Civil War. Whether or not Lincoln actually said this to Harriet, the facts certainly support the book's importance in starting the process of war. Meanwhile, Harriet's chief gadfly, Isabella, having birthed her last child, Alice, in 1849, returned to her duties as wife and mother. Now, Isabella and Edward endured a number of family tragedies, beginning with their difficult experiences with Edward Jr. Although the historical record is spotty on this, it appears that after their return to Boston in the 1840s, the Beechers found a farm family in Sharon, Massachusetts, named the Billings, to take in Edward Jr. He stayed with his family until his death in 1873. It was not unusual for well-off families of the period to pay other families to care for significantly disabled children. Although mentally challenged due to his early illness, Edward Jr. may well have been suited for farm labor. In any event, he was not with the family when they returned to Illinois in 1855 in order for Edward to take up a post as pastor of a church in Galesburg. There, he and Isabella remained, retaining their anti-slavery stance until 1871, when they moved back east. Of the Beechers' 11 children, three died in infancy, 2 more died at age 20. 2 more died relatively early, Alice at 41 and George at 39. Only 3 children, Frederick, Eugene, and Mary, survived Isabella and Edward, who both died in 1895. One child who died at 20, Albert, was killed in a tragic boating accident in Georgetown, Massachusetts in 1867, along with 2 children of Edward's brother, Charles. This picture that's on your screen is the only known picture of Isabella. She's on the right. Her husband, Edward, is next to her, and then Charles and his wife on the left. Unfortunately, the picture is a bit blurred, but that is there at the gravesite of the children killed in this terrible boating accident. Taken as a whole, Isabella's struggles and losses as the primary parent of the family are quite remarkable. However, a sense of duty was strong in her, and she endured all the way while retaining her pivotal role in the extensive network that was the Beecher family. News of Edward's death in Brooklyn in July of 1895 merited a long column on the front page of the New York Times. Isabella was present at his bedside and at his funeral. Although she in turn died that November, it was difficult for me to find any notice of her death or burial. Several genealogical sites have her buried in the same Brooklyn cemetery as Edward, but my research discovered that this was not the case. In death, as during many periods of her marriage, Isabella was separated from her husband. It appears that her son Frederick, who was the pastor of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in upstate New York, took her to his parsonage from Brooklyn after Edward's death. She died there several months later. Church records and Georgetown, Massachusetts records reveal that she was buried in that town's Harmony Cemetery, which has a Beecher family plot. The plot is in rather poor condition, and many of the names on the gravestones are illegible, but it's almost certain this is where Isabella lies, as unheralded in death as she was in life. At least 3 of her children lie near her. At rest, Isabella Porter Beecher was more connected to her extended family than she was to Edward himself. Whether she or her son Frederick made the choice for her final resting place, we do not know. However, because of her central role both in her own family and in communications between members of the illustrious Beecher family, the choice is a fitting one. I'm not sure I told you this before, but she really kept those circular letters going and called out anyone who would not participate. So I went to Isabella's grave in Georgetown. There was still a little snow on the ground, kind of a winter type day. I thought of the extraordinary life that this largely unknown woman had led. As I looked west, I thought of her travels, what she had gone through. She'd not stayed in comfortable New England, but had established and maintained a frontier household and helped open the West to the ideas of and culture of New England. She had endured numerous family tragedies and an oft absent husband, but she had done her duty both to nuclear and extended family with stoicism and wit. And finally, despite being a person who for both societal and personal reasons had shunned the public spotlight, she had played a pivotal role in inciting the war that erased slavery, which she so abhorred. So as I looked west from her grave, I finally thought, yes, Harriet, there are lives of women, and they are very much worth writing about. So that's the story.
Wow, Ron, thank you so much for sharing Isabella's story with us. Now, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and ask those with the Q&A feature or the chat feature. I think I'll just start us off if that's all right. I was really curious as to what was it that inspired you to start this research? What was it about Isabella that really hooked you?
Well, as I said at the outset, I was interested in that quote from Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, that the lives of women were not written in this time period. And as I noted, you've got very few women were in the public sphere in America. They were in the domestic sphere. So finding anything was difficult. So I kind of went out with the idea that women's lives were important, even if they hadn't been widely reported. And, the Beechers were shall we say, a prodigious producer of other Beechers. And so I figured, well, that's Litchfield Beechers, so we'll find somebody, and I did.
All right, so I'm just gonna ask a couple questions that are coming in right now. Do you know, are Isabella's Coffin cousins, so I guess the Mary Coffin, are they related to Levi Coffin or Lucretia Coffin Mott? You know?
I don't know that relationship. There were a lot of coffins, and there were some coffins from Nantucket. It's not the same. That may be who you're referring to. They were well known too. But as far as I know, at least, there weren't that many people around that time. In that time, so it's probably
we do.
A relationship. Yeah.
So speaking of, not that many people around at the time, and the fact that Edward would have been a prominent Illinois resident. Another question we just got from Peter was, he wonders, as a prominent Illinois resident in Lincoln's era, do you have any idea if Isabella and Edward ever interacted with Lincoln while they were both in Illinois?
Well, I don't think, I'm sure, I'm not sure. The only interaction that I came across with the Beechers specifically was this story that some people have said it's true, some not, that Harriet had been at some kind of reception with Lincoln, and Lincoln had said, it was your book. This is the little lady that started the Civil War, or something along those lines. That's he may have said that to her. He may have said it in general. The Beechers were such a prominent and large family at the time that I wouldn't be surprised if other Beechers ran into Lincoln, from time to time. But in Illinois, they were in Illinois before Lincoln. Let's see, they left in 1840s. Lincoln was just getting going as a lawyer in the Springfield, Jacksonville area. He was in Jacksonville a lot. So I suppose it's theoretically possible they ran into each other at that time, but I don't know.
Yeah, not sure. This one's a quick, easy one to answer, so I'll ask it. Would you mind repeating where Isabella was buried?
Yeah, it's in Harmony Cemetery in Georgetown, Massachusetts. And this was kind of I think a summer enclave of the Beechers, Georgetown. I was pretty confident when I finally found the records that she was buried there. Didn't give any more details, except that she was buried and that was both in the church in upstate New York had that record that she was there, and the Georgetown records indicated it.
Right.
But it was, unfortunately, the Beecher plot there has become kind of overgrown. Nobody's taking care of it. And so you'd really have to look in the records to see which Beechers are there. But several of her children are.
Right. And another question we have from Carolina was, and this is just a fun one to answer, what the connection is to Litchfield County. Would you mind explaining that again?
Well, the connection to Litchfield County?
Yeah.
Well, everybody in this story went to the Litchfield Female Academy.
That's right.
Including Edward. Did I mention that boys went to, I may have forgotten to mention that, but some boys, local boys did go Litchfield Female Academy. Harriet went there, Isabella, Catherine. The Lyman Beecher gave lectures in exchange for letting his kids go there, whether they were male or female.
And this actually kind of leads right into a comment from Linda, who's our archivist. She's just curious, which might be a fun exercise to do, is to take that genealogical chart and look to see how many of the people on the chart attended either the Litchfield Female Academy or the Litchfield Law School, because I bet if you do that, you're gonna find.
Well, Litchfield was a very important place.
Yeah,
and still is, of course.
Yep. Linda mentions, Rufus King, who was, correct me, that was
a major figure in Maine and was a signer of the Constitution.
Right, and his sons also come to school here in Litchfield.
Is that right?
Law school. So I think, Linda, you are right that those would have been Isabella's cousins. So we see just all of these people connecting here in Litchfield.
Well, one thing I'm excited about is that I hope other folks also will try to dig up some lives of women, because it's very hard to find them. And I mean, if you think of going through having 11 children just to start with, as a male, I'm blown away by that, plus all the problems for those children. Right. Moving west, setting up, it was really a frontier. I have to keep emphasizing that. I mean, it was really a frontier household. And, she came from a prominent family, but she made do.
Yeah.
And, and by chance, I guess, she may have helped incite the Civil War.
Oh, great. We have a bunch of comments that I just want to make sure we touch on. One person asking if the copy of your chart is available, which
that would be you. Can you make it available?
Yeah, we can make that happen.
I don't think
Absolutely.
There's a copyright on it, is there? I tell you need the chart. I had to look at it from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. And then we had an early question that I thought was interesting. So, do you know how much of a culture? The question is, do you know how much of a cultural life Isabella lived? So that's maybe asking.
Yeah, well, she was, as from reading her letters and the letters of all in the family, you realize they were all well educated, certainly for women. I mean, she writes very well, and the cultural life there in Jacksonville. I guess I haven't told everybody else this, but I was born in Jacksonville and actually went to high school there. But the cultural life at the time, would have been completely on College Hill. It was a kind of a down and out, beat up frontier town other than that. And so her cultural life would have been with the Easterners who were, who were the college teachers and the administrators, and with her family back home. But she did teach school, as I mentioned. She did get involved with this group that I mentioned, I think 167 years, gave money to poor women for education. So she was involved with those things. If you read these letters, and there are lots of them, the discussion is often of household matters, but from time to time of political matters as well. The cultural life she lived would have been the life of Litchfield in Jacksonville. I mean, because those were the people. They were the Yale people that came out, the Yale band, etc.
Right.
So, to the extent they could make it happen in the frontier, they did.
Excellent. Great. Let's see if anybody has any other questions. Let's see. Oh, there's one over here. Do you know if she was involved in the Underground Railroad?
Well, Illinois College in Jacksonville was a major stop on the Underground Railroad. And, that was there were other places in Jacksonville that were on it. So Edward was clearly involved because the college was involved and all those that were there were involved. So she would have been involved to the extent that, the other faculty, the other Easterners, New Englanders were involved. And once she got radicalized by the killing of their friend in Alton, she just beat on everybody in the family to stop being conservative. Abolition has got to happen. And yes, so the Underground Railway was, Illinois College was a major stop.
Yeah. And I think you hit on something I kept thinking is just how much Lovejoy's death would have really, it sounds like after that happened, she got really quite.
It really changed her whole attitude.
Inspired, yeah.
And some of the Beechers have been fairly conservative on the issue, including Harriet. So she had to sort of go after Catherine, go after, I read you a short thing there where she got after Catherine, said, come on, you're missing what's going on here.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I'm sure living in Illinois, like living on the frontier and on the border of this would have really been hugely transformative.
Well, the town itself was split down the middle. With people who'd come up from the South, Kentucky and such, and were not abolitionists. They were pro-slavery. So the town of Jacksonville itself was split down the middle, which was one of the reasons that I think Edward finally left. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of political pressure and financial pressure.
Yeah. Fantastic. Let's see. If there are any other questions for Ron, please, please go ahead and ask them.
If you think of any later, I suppose that they could get in touch with you and you could get in touch with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Any follow-up questions, just pass them along. But wow, I think this is a really great look into the life of a really not well-known woman. So thank you, Ron, so much
for allowing me the opportunity.
Yeah, and for all of our participants, just an FYI, we will be sending out a poll at the end of this. So when you sort of close out of the lecture, the sort of post-Zoom page has a survey. If you wouldn't mind just filling that out for us, that way we can know. Thanks
a lot for putting up with me.
Oh, Ron, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing all of your research. And again, just, oh, yep. We're getting lots of thanks in the chat. So everybody's saying thank you for such a great night. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Ron, again for presenting. And we hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Thank you.